There are moments in war when the old ways surface through the modern machinery, when something older than doctrine moves through the smoke and wire, and the institutions built to record and classify human action find themselves confronting a kind of knowledge they were never designed to hold. Some men become ghosts before they die. Some disappear so completely that their absence becomes its own evidence. A hole in the official record shaped exactly like a person the system could not contain. Before we go further, I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever known someone who seemed to understand a landscape in a way that went beyond knowledge, someone who could read terrain or weather, or the movement of animals not through training but through something deeper, something you could not name? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every one of them, and the stories you share from your own families and regions shape how I understand these histories. November of 1967 arrived in Guilin District not as calendar date, but as atmospheric condition. The monsoon season had broken early that year along the demilitarized zone, leaving the red clay hills slick and unstable, the vegetation so thick with moisture that moving through it meant pushing aside curtains of living water. This was not the Vietnam of rice paddies and delta villages. This was mountain country, a series of limestone ridges running parallel to the DMZ, forested slopes that rose into mist every morning and held that mist until midday. Ravines where French colonial troops had died 20 years earlier, and their bones still surfaced after heavy rain. The air smelled of rotting vegetation and cordite residue, wood smoke from distant villages, and the particular sourness that came from red mud disturbed by human passage. The roads in Guilin were not roads in any American sense. They were compressed earth tracks that turned to channels of standing water when it rained, impassable for anything heavier than a quarter-ton truck, monitored constantly by North Vietnamese observers on the ridgelines who recorded every vehicle movement in penciled notebooks and transmitted coordinates south through runners who moved at night. The nearest fire base sat 4 miles east, a constellation of sandbagged bunkers and corrugated metal that housed 200 men who had been there for 7 months and expected to be there for 7 more. They ate sea rations heated over diesel-soaked sand, drank water that tasted of iodine tablets, and slept in shifts because the incoming mortar fire arrived at unpredictable intervals designed to prevent rest. This was the tactical edge of the war, the place where American doctrine met Vietnamese terrain and discovered that terrain would not yield to doctrine. The military maps showed contour lines and grid coordinates, but they did not show the cave systems that honeycombed the limestone, the underground streams that had carved passages large enough for men to move through in single file, the vertical shafts that opened suddenly in the jungle floor and dropped 30 feet into darkness. The Vietnamese had been fighting in these mountains for generations. The Americans had been there for 3 years and still did not understand how the enemy moved. Sergeant James Whitehorse stood 6 feet and 1 inch tall, but the height sat differently on him than it did on other men of that measurement. His frame was not the broad-shouldered build of farm labor or factory work, but something leaner, produced by decades of movement across open ground, under full sun, the kind of physical conditioning that came from walking rather than lifting, from covering distance rather than moving weight. His hands told a more specific story. The palms were calloused in the pattern characteristic of rope work and climbing, thick pads at the base of each finger, hardened crescents, where the hand closed around objects under tension. The right thumb showed a white scar across the pad where something sharp had gone deep enough to leave permanent tissue, and the webbing between thumb and forefinger on both hands had darkened from sun exposure in a way that suggested he habitually held his hands in a particular position while sighting. His left wrist carried a burn scar, circular and deliberate, the kind produced by pressing flesh against heated metal in a controlled motion rather than by accident. His face was angular, the cheekbones prominent in a way that created deep shadows in certain light, but the left side of his jaw sat slightly higher than the right, an asymmetry subtle enough that most people never registered it consciously, but pronounced enough that photographs of him always looked faintly unfamiliar to anyone who had met him in person. He wore his hair short in compliance with regulation, but not shaved to the scalp like some of the other men. It remained black and coarse, cut to a 1/4 inch. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in low light, and they carried a quality that other soldiers described variously as watchfulness or distance or patience. But what they truly communicated was something closer to permanent assessment, the gaze of someone who processed information without pause and reached conclusions without announcing them. Psychologically, he operated from a position most people did not recognize as trauma because it had occurred so early and so completely that it had become structure rather than wound. He trusted physical laws absolutely, gravity, ballistics, the behavior of light and shadow, and trusted human institutions not at all. He feared enclosure more than he feared death, small spaces more than enemy fire, and the specific horror of being buried alive had shaped his tactical thinking in ways he had never articulated to anyone. What he carried without knowing he carried it was the accumulated weight of being always partially elsewhere, of moving through American military culture as someone who understood its language but did not speak it as a first tongue, who could perform its requirements without believing in its assumptions. The decision that had defined his present had come 6 years earlier when he was 17 years old, standing in the recruitment office in Flagstaff, Arizona, with two choices that were not really choices at all: sign the papers or return to the reservation where there was no work and no future except the one his father had lived, which was drinking and waiting and dying at 43. He had signed. He had not looked back, because looking back served no function. He had trained himself to move forward through whatever terrain presented itself, and to solve the problems immediately in front of him without reference to the problems that would come after. The world around James Whitehorse in November of 1967 was a military structure layered over a landscape that refused to conform to military logic. Geo Linh District was technically under South Vietnamese government control, but control meant something different here than it did in official reports. It meant American forces held the fire bases and the main supply routes during daylight hours, and North Vietnamese forces held the mountains and the night, and the local population moved between these two realities with practiced fluidity, providing labor to whichever side was present, and providing information to whichever side asked the right questions in the right way. Power in this environment did not flow from rank or equipment, but from the ability to read the space between what people said and what they meant, to understand which villagers were providing accurate information and which were performing cooperation while preparing for the American withdrawal they knew would eventually come. Captain Douglas Kern commanded the fire base and had been in country for 11 months, long enough to understand he did not understand the war he was fighting, but not long enough to stop pretending he did. He was 32 years old, a West Point graduate who had expected mechanized warfare in Europe and instead found himself managing an installation that was shelled nightly by an enemy he rarely saw. He trusted procedure because procedure was what he had been trained to trust. And when procedure failed, he wrote reports that explained the failure in terms that preserved the validity of procedure itself. Specialist Eddie Callahan served as Whitehorse's spotter when Whitehorse worked in the reconnaissance role, a 20-year-old from Kentucky coal country who had learned to read terrain by hunting in the Cumberland Gap and who recognized in Whitehorse a similar capacity for stillness, for becoming part of the landscape rather than moving through it. Callahan had small hands for a man of his size, scarred across the knuckles from childhood fights, and he carried a St. Christopher medal his mother had given him that he touched before every operation without consciously knowing he was doing it. He would be dead by January. Then there was Sergeant First Class Raymond Bosch, a lifer who had served in Korea and understood that wars were won or lost based on logistics and intelligence rather than courage. A man who kept 3 notebooks in which he recorded every piece of information that passed through the Firebase Operations Center, cross-referencing and annotating in a private system no one else could decipher. Bosch had gray eyes that seemed colorless in certain light, and a habit of watching Whitehorse with an expression that was not quite suspicion, but was not quite trust either. The look of someone trying to determine whether what he was seeing could be explained within existing frameworks or required new categories. And there was Corporal Min, a South Vietnamese liaison, who had been born in Hue and educated by French missionaries, and who spoke 4 languages fluently, and moved between cultural contexts with an ease that suggested he was fully present in none of them. Min had elegant hands, the fingers long and uncalloused, except for a single thick callus on the right middle finger from holding a pen, and he wore a jade ring on his left hand that he said had belonged to his grandfather, but that Whitehorse suspected was much older than that, a piece of serious antiquity Min was carrying through the war for reasons he would never explain to an American. The inciting decision came on the morning of November 8th, not as dramatic revelation, but as administrative assignment. Captain Kern called Whitehorse into the operations bunker, a space that smelled of mildew and diesel fuel, lit by a single bulb that hung from a wire and swayed slightly in the air current from the ventilation shaft. Kern had a map spread across the plywood table, the plastic overlay marked with grease pencil notations that showed patrol routes and known enemy positions. He did not look up when Whitehorse entered. "We need reconnaissance on the ridge complex northwest of here," Kern said. 2 clicks into disputed territory. Intelligence thinks they are moving supplies through at night, but we do not have confirmation. I want you to position and observe for 72 hours. Document movement patterns. Do not engage unless compromise is imminent." Whitehorse looked at the map. The ridge Kern had indicated was a limestone formation that rose 300 meters above the surrounding terrain, forested on the eastern slope and bare rock on the western face. The approach would require moving through a valley that funneled sound, and the position itself offered no covered withdrawal route if compromise occurred. "Spotter?" Whitehorse asked. "Callahan, he is already briefed." Whitehorse studied the map for another moment. There was a detail Kern had not mentioned, a small notation in Vietnamese script near the base of the ridge that indicated a sacred site. Probably a family shrine or ancestor altar. Local populations avoided those areas after dark for reasons that had nothing to do with military tactics, which meant if North Vietnamese forces were moving through the area, they were choosing tactical advantage over cultural observance, which meant the supply route was important enough to override other considerations. "When?" Whitehorse asked. "You leave at 1600, insertion by foot. Radio silence unless contact is made." Whitehorse felt the small hesitation that always preceded acceptance of a mission that required him to be away from defensible positions for extended periods. He felt it, and he overrode it the way he always did, by focusing on the technical requirements of the task rather than the psychological weight of isolation. He did not complete the thought that had started to form, which was that 3 days in that terrain would require him to become something other than a soldier, to access ways of moving and perceiving that the Army had not taught him and did not have language for. He knew what worked in that kind of environment. He knew it would work again. He did not need to announce it or explain it or justify it in terms Kern would recognize as doctrine. "Understood," he said. Life in the deep, once Whitehorse and Callahan had moved beyond the American perimeter and into the forest proper, settled into a rhythm that had nothing to do with military time and everything to do with the movement of light and shadow through triple canopy jungle. They moved in the late afternoon and early evening, covering perhaps half a kilometer per hour, pausing every 10 minutes to listen for a full minute without moving, reading the bird calls and insect sounds for disruption patterns that would indicate other human presence. They did not speak except in hand signals. Callahan moved well for someone who had learned fieldcraft in Appalachian mountains rather than Southwest desert, his footfalls deliberate and his breathing controlled, but Whitehorse could hear the small differences between Callahan's movement and true silence, the faint catch of fabric against vegetation, the slightly heavier tread of the right foot, the way Callahan's breathing became audible when they moved uphill. These were not criticisms. They were simply data. Whitehorse cataloged them the way he cataloged everything, building a mental model of the soundscape they were creating and adjusting his own movement to compensate for Callahan's signature. They reached the base of the ridge formation just after dark on the first day and did not attempt to climb in darkness. Instead, they found a position in a dense thicket of bamboo, established a listening post, and waited. The night sounds of the jungle at that elevation were different from the sounds at lower altitudes. Fewer frogs, more nocturnal birds, the occasional crack of branches that might have been wind or might have been something moving through the canopy. Whitehorse did not sleep. He entered instead a state that was not quite sleep and not quite waking, a mode of awareness he had learned as a child during long hunts in the Arizona high country, where the body rested but the senses remained active, processing information without conscious analysis. When dawn came, it came slowly, the darkness thinning to gray, and then to pale gold light that filtered through the canopy in distinct shafts, and Whitehorse could see that the ridge above them was exactly as the map had indicated, but also nothing like the map had indicated. The eastern slope was not uniformly forested, but striped with bands of vegetation and bare rock, where the soil was too thin to support trees, and these stripes created natural paths that would be invisible from aerial reconnaissance but obvious from ground level. At the base of the ridge, partially hidden by overgrowth, was a structure that had not appeared on any military map. A small shrine built from stacked stones, weathered to the point of near dissolution, but still recognizable as intentional construction. Someone had been there recently. Fresh incense ash lay in the offering bowl. Callahan saw it too, and looked at Whitehorse with a question in his eyes that he did not voice. Whitehorse shook his head slightly. They moved past the shrine without disturbing it and began the climb. The first anomaly occurred on the second night, when they had been in position on the ridge for 28 hours and had documented 3 separate groups of North Vietnamese soldiers moving south through the valley below, small units of 4 to 6 men carrying supplies in woven baskets balanced on shoulder poles. The pattern was consistent. They moved in the hours just after full dark, navigating by starlight and what appeared to be intimate knowledge of the terrain, following paths that were not visible as paths until someone was standing directly on them. Whitehorse had marked their positions and timings in his notebook with the intention of radioing coordinates once the 72-hour observation period ended. But on the second night, perhaps an hour after the last supply group had passed through, Whitehorse heard something that did not fit the established pattern. It was not a sound he could identify. It was the absence of sound where sound should have been. The insects in the valley below had gone silent in a wave pattern that moved from south to north, and the silence held for perhaps 90 seconds before the normal soundscape resumed. Callahan had been sleeping. Whitehorse did not wake him. The silence might have been caused by an animal, a large python or a wild pig moving through the undergrowth. It might have been caused by human movement that was quieter than the groups they had already observed, someone moving alone and with greater care. It might have been nothing at all, a coincidence of insect behavior that had no tactical meaning. Whitehorse watched the valley for another 2 hours and saw nothing. He noted the incident in his book with a question mark beside it. He did not mention it to Callahan when Callahan woke for his watch at 0300. There was nothing to mention. There was only a silence that had happened and then stopped happening, and Whitehorse had learned long ago that reporting anomalies you could not explain was a fast way to lose the confidence of command. He filed it mentally as interesting data and continued the observation. The accumulation began in ways so subtle that even Whitehorse, who was trained to notice subtlety, almost missed the pattern forming. On the third day, their final day in position before extraction, he noticed that the supply groups moving through the valley had changed their timing by approximately 30 minutes, now passing through earlier in the evening when slightly more ambient light remained. This was tactically sound. It reduced the risk of navigation errors in complete darkness, but it was also a break from the pattern they had established over the previous nights, which suggested someone had modified the plan based on new information. Whitehorse considered the possibility that the North Vietnamese had detected the observation post. But if that were true, the logical response would be to halt movement entirely or to stage an ambush, not to adjust timing by half an hour. Then there was the matter of the shrine at the base of the ridge. On their descent that afternoon, moving carefully in the fading light, Whitehorse passed the shrine again and saw that someone had left a new offering, a small bundle of rice wrapped in leaves, placed beside the incense bowl. The rice was fresh. It had not been there on their ascent, which meant someone had visited the shrine in the last 48 hours, while Whitehorse and Callahan had been on the ridge above. The local population avoided this area. That was established. So who had left the offering, and why had they chosen to do it during a period of active military observation? Whitehorse took a photograph of the shrine with the small camera he carried for documentation purposes. He did not touch the offering. That evening, after they had moved 2 kilometers east and established a temporary patrol base for the night before returning to the fire base, Callahan mentioned something Whitehorse had not noticed. "We have been followed," Callahan said quietly, "not closely. But someone has been paralleling our route since we left the ridge." "How do you know?" Whitehorse asked. "Bird calls. Same pattern repeating every 20 minutes. Not a bird." Whitehorse had not heard it, which troubled him more than the information itself. He trusted Callahan's ability to distinguish between natural and human-generated sounds. The man had grown up hunting in mountains where disturbance meant the difference between eating and going hungry. But Whitehorse prided himself on noticing everything, and he had missed this. He thought back through the afternoon's movement and realized that he had been focused on forward observation and had not been paying attention to their rear. An error. A small one, but errors compounded. "How many?" Whitehorse asked. "1 person, maybe 2. Hard to tell." They did not discuss it further. They established watch rotations and moved through the night in 2-hour increments of wakefulness and rest, and nothing happened. But Whitehorse noticed, now that Callahan had pointed it out, that the normal jungle sounds did seem to hesitate and resume in patterns that might have been natural and might not have been. At 0400, during Whitehorse's watch, he heard a sound that was definitely not natural, the faint metallic click of a weapon safety being disengaged and then re-engaged, the sound dampened but not eliminated, perhaps 60 meters away in the darkness. He did not wake Callahan. He simply listened. The sound did not repeat. Whoever was out there was maintaining distance, observing but not approaching. Whitehorse found this more disturbing than an attack would have been, an attack he could respond to. Observation meant someone was gathering information, and he did not know what conclusions they were drawing or what they intended to do with those conclusions. When dawn came, they broke camp and moved toward the fire base perimeter, and Whitehorse had the persistent sensation of being watched from multiple directions simultaneously, a feeling he could not verify but also could not dismiss. They crossed back into American-controlled territory just after 0900 and reported to Captain Kern for debriefing. The debriefing lasted 40 minutes. Whitehorse provided the coordinates and timings of the supply movements they had observed. Kern seemed satisfied. He did not ask about the shrine or the rice offering or the presence Callahan had detected. Whitehorse did not volunteer the information. It was not that he intended to withhold intelligence. It was that he did not yet know what the information meant, and providing partial data that raised more questions than it answered struck him as worse than remaining silent until the picture clarified. Kern dismissed them. Callahan went to get food. Whitehorse went to the communications bunker and requested access to the intelligence files on local population movements in the Gio-Linh sector. The files were thin, mostly census data from the South Vietnamese government that was 2 years out of date and probably inaccurate, even when it had been current. But there was one notation that caught his attention. A report from a Marine patrol 3 months earlier mentioned encountering an elderly Vietnamese man near the same ridge complex Whitehorse had just observed, a man who had claimed to be tending family graves, but who had been traveling alone in an area where civilians were not supposed to be present. The Marines had detained him briefly, verified that he was carrying only ritual items and food offerings, and released him with a warning. The report described him as cooperative but evasive when questioned about his knowledge of enemy activity in the area. No follow-up investigation had been conducted. Whitehorse requested a copy of the report and took it back to his quarters, a sandbagged tent he shared with 2 other soldiers who were currently on patrol. He read the report 3 times, looking for details the Marine who had written it might not have known were significant. The old man had been carrying a particular type of incense that was used in ancestor worship, but also in pre-Buddhist animist rituals that persisted in rural Vietnamese communities. He had been wearing a cord around his neck that the Marines had noted, but not confiscated, described as a leather thong with a small pouch attached, contents unknown. Whitehorse knew what that was. It was a protective amulet, the kind that people wore when they believed they were entering spiritually dangerous territory, which raised the question of what the old man had believed made that territory dangerous, and whether the danger he perceived had any relationship to the tactical situation Whitehorse was being asked to assess. Over the next 2 weeks, Whitehorse ran 4 more reconnaissance missions into the ridge complex and the surrounding valleys, each time with Callahan as spotter, each time documenting North Vietnamese supply movements that followed increasingly complex patterns. The enemy was adapting to American observation, changing routes and timings in ways that suggested they knew they were being watched, but could not determine exactly where the observation was coming from. Whitehorse was good at his work. He had always been good at his work, but something about this environment was different from other areas where he had operated. The jungle felt layered, as though multiple realities were occupying the same physical space, and he found himself perceiving things he could not explain in terms of conventional reconnaissance. On one mission, he saw a grove of trees that had been marked with symbols carved into the bark, symbols that resembled nothing in his training materials, but that generated in him an immediate and powerful sense of warning, a physical aversion so strong that he altered his planned route to avoid passing directly through the grove, even though doing so cost him an extra hour of movement time. On another mission, he woke from shallow sleep with the absolute certainty that something was standing just beyond the perimeter of his position, something that was watching him with intention, but without hostility. And when he opened his eyes, he saw nothing, but had the lingering impression of having been assessed and found acceptable. According to criteria he did not understand, he did not report these experiences. They were not tactically relevant. They were psychological phenomena, probably the product of extended time in isolation under stress, and he handled them the way he handled all psychological phenomena, which was to acknowledge them without allowing them to influence his operational decisions. But they accumulated. Each mission added another layer of strangeness to his understanding of the terrain, until he began to suspect that the tactical situation in Gio-Linh was embedded within a larger and older context that American intelligence had not mapped because American intelligence did not have categories for mapping it. On the 17th of December, Callahan died. They were moving through a valley 3 kilometers northwest of the fire base, conducting a routine patrol to verify that a particular trail network was no longer being used for supply movements when Callahan stepped on a pressure-detonated mine that had been buried so carefully that even Whitehorse's advanced checking had not detected it. The explosion was not large. It did not need to be large. Callahan was alive for perhaps 2 minutes afterward. Conscious but unable to speak, his eyes locked on Whitehorse's face with an expression that was not fear but something closer to apology, as though he were sorry for making a mistake that was going to cause Whitehorse inconvenience. Whitehorse held pressure on the severed femoral artery, even though he knew it was functionally useless, the damage too extensive, and the blood loss too rapid for field medicine to address. He felt Callahan's pulse fade and stop. He sat with the body for another 10 minutes, not because sitting served any purpose, but because leaving immediately felt like a betrayal of something he could not name. Then he stood, marked the coordinates, and began the movement back to the fire base alone. He carried Callahan's identification tags and personal effects. He left the body where it had fallen because carrying it would have compromised his ability to move quickly through enemy territory, and Callahan was beyond caring about the disposition of his physical remains. When Whitehorse reached the fire base and reported the incident, Captain Kern asked if he wanted to take time before returning to operational duty. Whitehorse said no. Kern assigned him a new spotter, a 19-year-old from Michigan named Peters, who had been in country for 6 weeks and did not yet understand that the war was not what he had expected it to be. Whitehorse took Peters on one patrol, determined that the kid moved through the jungle like he was expecting someone to hand him a medal for showing up, and requested permission to operate alone. Kern was reluctant. Standard procedure required 2-man teams for reconnaissance, but Whitehorse pointed out that he had better operational results working solo than he had ever achieved with a partner, and Kern could not argue with documented success. Permission was granted on a provisional basis. Whitehorse began going into the field alone. The change was immediate and profound. Without a partner to coordinate with, without the need to adjust his movement to someone else's rhythm or to communicate through signals, Whitehorse found himself slipping into a mode of operation that was not covered in any field manual. He moved through the jungle not as a human observer passing through enemy territory, but as part of the system itself, finding positions that should not have been defensible, and discovering that from those positions he could see everything. He began to understand the terrain not as a static feature to be mapped, but as something dynamic, something that shifted according to principles he perceived intuitively rather than analytically. He knew when North Vietnamese forces were going to move through an area before they arrived, not because he had intelligence indicating their plans, but because he could feel the disturbance in the landscape that preceded their passage, the way a tracker could feel a herd of elk moving through distant timber by the vibration in the ground. He established firing positions in locations that appeared exposed on approach, but revealed themselves to be perfectly concealed once occupied, as though the land itself was offering him shelter. He began leaving the fire base for 7- and 8-day periods, carrying minimal supplies and living off what he could find, returning only to report coordinates and resupply ammunition. The other soldiers started calling him Smoke, not because he asked them to, but because the name emerged organically from the way he seemed to appear and disappear without transition, materializing in the operations bunker after days in the field without anyone having seen him approach the perimeter. Sergeant First Class Bosch was the first person to say directly what others were thinking. "You are operating outside doctrine," Bosch said. They were alone in the operations bunker, late at night, reviewing patrol maps. I do not care if it is effective. I care that I cannot explain it in after-action reports. Write what you see, Whitehorse said. What I see does not make sense. Then write what makes sense. Bosch looked at him for a long moment, those gray eyes flat and assessing. You are going to disappear out there, Bosch said. One of these days you are going to go into that jungle, and you are not going to come back. And we are not going to know what happened to you. Whitehorse did not respond. Bosch was probably right, but the alternative, staying close to the firebase, operating according to standard reconnaissance protocols, working with partners who moved like Americans moved through foreign terrain, felt like trying to fight with his hands tied. He had found something in the Geolin Mountains that worked, that produced results, and he was not going to abandon it because it made people uncomfortable. The confrontation with the unresolvable came on the night of January 23rd, during the early hours of what would later be called the Tet Offensive, though at the time it was simply chaos spreading across every American position in South Vietnam. Simultaneously, Whitehorse had been in the field for 6 days, positioned on a ridgeline 8 kilometers northwest of the firebase, observing what appeared to be a major staging area for North Vietnamese forces. He had documented the arrival of more than 200 soldiers over a 3-day period, along with ammunition crates and heavy weapons components that indicated preparation for a significant assault. He had called in coordinates for artillery strikes, but the artillery never came because every firebase in the region was under attack and ammunition was being conserved for direct defense. He knew the firebase where Callahan had died was probably being overrun. He knew extraction was not coming. He knew he had perhaps 12 hours before the North Vietnamese forces in the valley below him moved out toward their assault positions, and he lost his tactical advantage. He could have withdrawn. That would have been the rational decision. Move east under cover of darkness, put distance between himself and the enemy concentration. Attempt to link up with American forces wherever they were consolidating. But he did not withdraw. He remained in position and began working. What happened over the next 14 hours was not combat in any conventional sense. It was a methodical application of long-range precision fire into targets that presented themselves without apparent awareness that they were being observed. Whitehorse fired 73 rounds. He did not miss. Each shot was a calculation of wind, distance, elevation, and timing, executed with a patience that erased thought and left only the physical reality of breath control and trigger pressure. He targeted officers first, then radio operators, then anyone who appeared to be organizing a response to the disruption he was creating. The North Vietnamese soldiers in the valley knew they were being fired upon, but they could not determine the direction of fire because Whitehorse was shooting from a position more than 800 meters away, elevated at an angle that made acoustic triangulation nearly impossible in the terrain. They scattered. They took cover. They sent patrols to sweep the surrounding area. But Whitehorse had chosen his position specifically because it could not be approached without exposure, and the patrols that attempted to reach him exposed themselves to the same precision fire that had targeted the officers. By noon, the valley had emptied. The North Vietnamese forces had withdrawn to regroup, abandoning their staging area and leaving behind equipment and supplies they could not carry. Whitehorse remained in position for another 4 hours, watching for signs of return, and when no return came, he descended from the ridge and moved east. He did not go back to the firebase. The firebase was gone. He knew it was gone before he saw the smoke rising from its location, knew it from the sustained artillery fire he had heard throughout the night and the sudden silence that had followed at dawn. He altered his route and moved instead toward a marine position 15 kilometers south, traveling through terrain he had never mapped, but that felt navigable in ways he did not question. He moved for 3 days, sleeping in 2-hour increments, eating almost nothing, and arrived at the marine perimeter so exhausted that he could barely speak when the sentries challenged him. They took him to the command post. They gave him water and food and asked him where he had come from. He told them. They did not believe him. The distances he described were not possible to cover on foot in the time he claimed. He showed them his identification. They radioed to verify his status and were told that Sergeant James Whitehorse was listed as missing in action, presumed dead, following the overrun of his firebase 6 days earlier. He was sitting in a folding chair in a tent that smelled of canvas and sweat, drinking water that tasted like plastic, listening to a captain tell him that according to official records, he was already gone. "We need to update your status," the captain said. "Get you processed back into the system." Whitehorse nodded. He knew what that meant. Debriefings, after-action reports, questions about how he had survived when his entire unit had been killed, questions about the operations he had been conducting alone in unsupported territory, questions about the 73 confirmed kills he would be expected to document and justify. He could see the shape of what was coming, the machinery of institutional accounting that would attempt to fit what he had done into categories that could be filed and explained and credited to the correct unit for the correct strategic purpose. He understood in that moment, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that he could not allow that process to occur. What he had been doing in Jiolin was not something that could be explained in after-action reports. It was not something the Army had language for. And attempting to translate it into official language would destroy the thing itself, would turn it into something lesser and more ordinary, a set of tactical procedures that could be taught to other soldiers who would then go into the mountains and die because they did not understand that the procedures were not the point. "I need to use the latrine," Whitehorse said. The captain gestured toward the door. Whitehorse stood and walked out of the tent. He walked past the latrines. He walked past the perimeter wire. He walked into the jungle, and he did not stop walking. The immediate crisis passed in the sense that Whitehorse survived the Tet Offensive, and the months that followed, though survived is perhaps the wrong word for what occurred. He moved through the highlands of central Vietnam for 3 months, alone, without radio contact or resupply, living off the land and occasionally trading with Montagnard villagers who seemed unsurprised by his presence. He spoke almost no Vietnamese, and they spoke no English, but communication occurred through gesture and exchange, and a quality of mutual recognition that did not require shared language. In April, he walked into a special forces camp near Pleiku and identified himself. The soldiers there had no record of him. His name did not appear in their databases. He was processed as a refugee, given clothing and food, and transported to a rear area base where military intelligence personnel interviewed him for 2 days and determined he was either deeply confused about his own identity or engaged in some kind of elaborate deception. They could not determine which. His fingerprints were not in the system. His service record, when they finally located it through archived channels, showed that he had been declared killed in action in January, and his file had been closed. There was no mechanism for reversing a death declaration for someone who had no surviving family to claim the body and no unit to advocate for reinstatement. The intelligence officers made a decision that was more administrative than strategic. They assigned him a new identity, enrolled him in a program for irregular indigenous personnel, and sent him back into the field as an advisor to South Vietnamese forces operating in the same region where he had previously worked. He accepted this without comment. For the next 2 years, he operated under a name that was not his own, conducting reconnaissance and direct action missions that were never officially recorded, producing results that were attributed to other units or to unnamed sources. He became, in official terms, a kind of persistent rumor, a figure referenced in after-action reports from multiple units but never photographed, never directly cited, never traceable to a specific individual in the personnel system. The South Vietnamese soldiers he worked with called him Ma Apache, the Apache Ghost, and told stories about him that mixed tactical observation with spiritual attribution. They said he could walk through enemy territory without being seen. They said he knew when ambushes were being prepared before the enemy had finished setting them. They said he spoke to the land, and the land answered him. Whether they believed these things literally or were simply using available cultural vocabulary to describe skills they recognized as exceptional was not clear and probably not important. What mattered was that the stories persisted and spread, creating a figure who existed more completely in oral tradition than in written record. In March of 1971, James Whitehorse walked away from a forward operating base near the Laotian border and did not return. The unit he had been advising reported him as absent without leave, then as missing, then stopped reporting on him at all when it became clear that no official record of his assignment existed to justify continued inquiry. Search operations were not conducted. No body was recovered. His second service record, the one created under his assumed identity, was marked as incomplete and filed away. Veterans who served in the Central Highlands during that period and who later attempted to locate him for reunions or memorials found nothing. The Army had no record of anyone matching his description serving in the capacities he had served. The CIA, when asked, stated they had no knowledge of operations matching the profile of his reported activities. The South Vietnamese government archives, accessed decades later by researchers, contained references to an American advisor known by a nickname that translated roughly as Ghost Walker. But no proper name was ever attached to the references, and no photograph existed. In the years that followed the war, stories about the Apache Ghost circulated in two separate communities that rarely intersected. Among American veterans, particularly those who had served in reconnaissance or special operations roles, Whitehorse became a kind of cautionary legend, the soldier who had gone so deep into the field that he could not come back, who had adapted so completely to the environment that he ceased to be compatible with military structure. The stories emphasized his skill, his isolation, and the unsettling quality of his presence, the way he seemed to appear without approach and disappear without departure. Among Vietnamese communities, both in Vietnam and in diaspora, a different set of stories circulated. These stories described a figure who had understood the land in ways foreigners were not supposed to understand it, who had shown respect for sacred places when other Americans had treated the landscape as tactically neutral ground, who had fought with precision and restraint rather than with the overwhelming destructive force that characterized American operations. These stories were less about military effectiveness and more about cultural crossing, about the rare occurrence of someone from one world learning to operate according to the principles of another world without attempting to dominate or replace those principles. The question of what actually happened to James Whitehorse after March of 1971 remains unresolved, though theories exist in abundance. Some believe he was killed in action and his body never recovered, lost to the jungle or to a grave the enemy dug and never marked. Some believe he was captured and died in captivity, either in North Vietnam or in one of the prison camps across the border in Laos, where American POWs were held in conditions that ensured few survived. Some believe he defected, either to the North Vietnamese or to one of the neutral countries bordering the region, and lived out his life under a third identity in a place where no one would think to look for an American soldier. Some believe he simply disappeared into the Central Highlands, integrated into a Montagnard community, married, raised children who never knew their father had once been someone else. Some believe he returned to the United States using false documentation and lived quietly in a place far from the war, working ordinary jobs and never speaking about what he had done or seen. Each theory has evidence that supports it and evidence that contradicts it. Each theory satisfies some aspect of the known facts while failing to account for others. The truth, if it exists, is buried under layers of classified documents and bureaucratic confusion and the simple erosion of time, which destroys memory as effectively as it destroys physical evidence. What remains undisputed is that something happened in the Jiolin Mountains between November of 1967 and March of 1971, something that involved a soldier who understood terrain in ways the military could not categorize, and who produced results the military could not deny but also could not explain. The system that was designed to record and preserve military action found itself confronting a kind of action that existed outside its categories. And the system responded the way systems always respond to what they cannot contain, by forgetting, by erasing, by allowing the inexplicable to fade into rumor and legend, while the official record remains clean and comprehensible. James Whitehorse became a hole in the documentation, a shape defined by absence rather than presence, and that absence tells its own story about what institutions can see and what they cannot, about what they can acknowledge and what they must deny in order to maintain their coherence. There are ways of knowing the world that cannot be written down in field manuals or taught in training courses, ways of moving through difficult terrain that come not from doctrine, but from something older and more fundamental. You carry these ways whether you know it or not. They are in your body and your attention and your capacity to recognize what the land is telling you when you stop talking long enough to listen. The story of the Apache ghost is not about supernatural ability or exceptional violence. It is about a person who remembered, in the middle of a modern industrial war, that human beings had been reading landscapes and moving through dangerous territory for thousands of years before there were armies or nations or official records, and that those old skills still worked if you knew how to access them. It is about the cost of that remembering, the isolation it produced, the way it separated him from the institutions that might have protected him and left him navigating by principles those institutions could not recognize. It is about the fact that he is gone now, wherever gone means, and the only traces he left behind are stories that contradict each other, and a few cryptic lines in documents that were never meant to be connected. I want to know what stories you carry from your own families, from your own regions, about people who seem to understand things they should not have been able to understand, who operated according to knowledge that was not written down anywhere, but that worked when nothing else did. Drop those stories in the comments. I read every one. This channel exists because you share the histories that official sources overlook, and those histories matter more than you might think. If this story meant something to you, if it connected to something you recognize in your own experience or your own family's past, hit that subscribe button. There are more of these stories than the record admits, and we are going to keep finding them together. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next one.